Hello everyone, welcome to the Studio Saptar and the Major Bookstore. Both these basically organizations are have been conducting a series of lectures called the Battle of Ideas. Why is it a battle of ideas? Because as you all may know that we are living in an age where there are ideas of barbarism on one side, and then on the other side there are ideas of humanity, and they are in a big clash. And that is why we call this our series Battle of Ideas, and we conduct these series on certain topics that help us challenge the right-wing ideas much better in our day-to-day lives and generally wherever we work, we stay, and do whatever. So basically today Comrade Prabir is here with us to take the lecture. So Prabir, you all already know, I don't have to introduce much. Basically, Prabir is an engineer and is a science activist. He's been with the People's Science Movement for a long time. He's also a founding member of Delhi Science Forum, and he's also founder of a news platform called NewsClick. That was in news recently, you all must know about it. And so he's here with us today, and let's just start with the lecture as soon as possible. We are all excited about it. We are also streaming it on YouTube, so people are joining there as well. So I think we'll just now give it a go.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. And I'll start by saying that, of course, that this is a very big topic in the sense that it is really something which is not possible to be exhaustive at all. So we are really talking about how to look at these issues rather than give a complete view, which of course will need much more study by all of you as well. So this is really, in that sense, not a final derived view of all these issues that we are going to discuss, but some pointers to the larger issue that what makes human society. Why do you call ourselves human? How are you different from others if we are? Not that the current barbarism, as was being talked of, makes us very different from others. We just have better weapons, it could be argued. So the question is, what in that sense, the larger question is, what do we call civilization itself? And how do you look at the evolution of society and civilization of which we are a part? So I want to go back a little to the past and start with essentially our country cousins, the apes and the monkeys and so on, and what differentiates us from them. Now, unfortunately, there has been this pictures which also infest a lot of the textbooks, which seem to show we are somehow at the apex of evolution. Now, evolution doesn't have an apex. It's really like branches, and all branches have a tip. So we are at the tip of an evolution of one branch, which is branched from other branches, as are all contemporary living beings, whether it's a plant or it's an animal or it's a fish. All of us are at the tip of our evolutionary path. It's not that we have descended from the monkeys, as it's quite often. Here it is. It's not that we have descended from the monkeys, and here we are talking about really a more restricted lot, which is chimpanzees, Neanderthals, modern humans. Well, the chimpanzees are also, who exist right now, they have also evolved. They're not the same chimpanzees we parted company some millions of years back. And so also, if you talk about monkeys, we parted even earlier. So the modern human line in that sense, separated from the chimpanzees, our cousins. Chimpanzees, bonobos are our closest cousins in evolutionary terms. We parted company about 9 to 6 billion years back. And then also further on, About 750,000, 550,000 years, 500,000 years back, we parted company with others also. And the Neanderthals and the modern humans had a evolutionary path which was still had mixtures, as you can see, they could interbreed. But they slowly, the modern humans have completely dominated the human landscape in terms of what we see as the remnants of the remains that we find that after a certain period, Neanderthals, and that's not the only ones, we also know Denisovans were also our contemporaries at some period, earlier period, the other contemporaries, that somehow modern Homo sapiens seems to have outcompeted all of them. Of course, there is still genes, Neanderthal genes and Denisovans genes in our genetic makeup, small amounts, but they're there. And it's also interesting where they are there. If you take Denisovans, for instance, you will find more in Eastern Asia and Southeast Asia, up to Australia, which is the ancient Australian population, which are, of course, as you know, through genocide, they have been reduced to a small minority. So this interbreeding continued for a fair amount. But after a certain time, either we have absorbed them or we have outcompeted them, and they don't exist independently. Now, the crux of our question today, what makes us human? And we are not going to say, we have philosophy, we have music and all those things. No, we'll start by when we are still competing with other animal species on the continent of Africa. Now, all of us are aware now, those debates have been settled, that essentially we came out of Africa. It's not surprising. All the major primates that we can talk about really originate from Africa. And all the basic human species that we have seen who come out of Africa, go to Asia, and we have been really, as species, we have been from the very beginning mobile. We cover large distances, we spread across continents. And this competition then becomes who outcompetes other species, other variants, whatever we want to call it, and slowly becomes dominant. Part absorption, part outcompeting. So, first is to recognize that all human species that emerged from our bifurcation, as we saw earlier with the chimpanzees, they were always marginal. That means they cannot be found in large numbers. Okay? They also, if you look at it this way, they are not strong in the sense of, say, a tiger is or a lion is. They're not really fast as many other species are. The cheetah or the tiger is really very fast. So what role, what is the evolutionary niche they had? I'm not going into different discussions on evolution in general, but as you know, each species has an evolutionary niche. That evolutionary niche comes from an interplay of natural forces, the climate, etc., but also other species, because it's not simply competition, there's predator-prey relationship. There is also competition between species combating for the same ecological niche. And of course, there is also the plants and other things that the species feed on, including, of course, smaller animals. So in all of this competition, we were again, for a long period, at the margin. In fact, if you take the genetic makeup of modern Homo sapiens, you will find that we have a kind of homogeneity which is very rare in any other species. As it is said that a troop of chimpanzees has more variation than the entire 7 billion human population. Why is that? Because at some point of time, we seem to have almost become extinct. And because we are on the verge of extinction, the number of founder, shall we say, the founder group that is there, which then became larger, was very small. And that's why the genetic variation is so low. So these are interesting asides, particularly as racist theories have been promulgated later. So these are interesting thoughts to hold with us, that the genetic variation in the human species is very, very low. Variation is very low. We are far more homogeneous than others. As I said, that also shows that we are at some point of time at the verge of extinction. And of course, a different human species would then have emerged, possibly. So let's not think that we were superior. So what makes, in the long run, human beings different from other species, the way we now are? That we can not only destroy ourselves, we can destroy other species, but we can destroy the whole Earth's, shall we say, biosphere as we know it. So given that, what has made us different is really the question. For the better or for the worse is an answer which you will all have to give to yourselves. But the point again is, in biological terms, what is it that made us different? And while the general feeling has been, we are much more brainy. The reality is the brain size is not that very different from other human competitors that were there, for instance, among the Homo sapiens. And we'll go over that a little later. So it doesn't seem to be that. But the initial evolutionary difference seems to have been that we had an opposable thumb. The opposable thumb in evolutionary terms is not a big issue. And a lot of the evolutionary changes that occur do not occur because there is an immediate benefit to that or not. Some of them are completely neutral. And I'll give you one example, which all of us have, that we have the earlobe. Okay? Some of it join the side, others don't. Now, apart from being able to, for the teacher to be able to pull the ear of the student, there is no evolutionary difference these two earlobes give us. Okay? And therefore, both persist in human beings, and it's completely neutral to any evolutionary change. So the opposable thumb, unlike other hands, if you take a chimpanzee, now the grip is relatively weaker because this opposable thumb gives it a certain strength to the grip. Now, why is the strength to the grip important? In terms of fighting other species, not much. In trying to throw stones, not much. But what is important in this is the ability to use quote-unquote tools. And the immediate tools that were used were obviously stone. And what was our evolutionary niche? If you see our evolutionary niche, the way we lived, we seem to have been competing with what would be called scavenger species. Scavengers are those, as you know, once the big kill has been eaten, the tiger or the lion is now full, they go away, and then other species come and try to eat whatever is left. So we were really competing with the hyenas, okay? And they were actually more ferocious and bigger than us. So we had to really fight them off or wait till they finished, and then we'll get our quota, so to say. So in this, the big stones or the ability to use stones have one big advantage. You can break the bones, which through teeth, neither the tiger or the lion or of course the smaller animals could really crack. And using these tools, you could break the bones and extract the bone marrow. So among the scavengers, we had an advantage. We could break the bones using the stone tools. Not much of an advantage as you will think, and that's correct. But still, we could also fight off maybe the scavengers and get a bigger share of the meat and so on. But this is the start of an evolutionary path. Takes eons, takes a long time, by which our tools may improve. Our tools could improve. So this is also interesting because we were at the time competing with what I call the Australopithecus. Now, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly or not, but they seem to disappear roughly at the time that our thumb appears, shall we say. So, ability to compete increases due to the fact that we now have a grip, which is different from other species which exist, which are also competing with us for the same ecological niche. So, this is the one important issue that happens, and this ability to shape tools, the ability to shape tools is the first differentiation we have of the human species from others. Why don't you come and sit in the front? Yeah. Because those who come late get the front bench. Okay, so this is the first evolutionary niche that we seem to fit in better, that because of the opposable thumb, we are able to make stone tools, which are not advanced stone tools as we will see, but they gave an advantage by creating for us an ecological niche in which we can extract certain things, we can feed on what the bigger animals have left, and actually we can even throw them at other animals, small animals, also brain a few small animals, and that seems to have been the start of our evolutionary path. The interesting part is that these are mostly used in situ. That means we found stones where the hunt was there, the animal was there, and we used stones around us to really create the first tools. After we had finished, we'd leave them there. It's not that they were used with a certain purpose, that we made it, we kept it with us, and we used it, and then we again kept it with us. That doesn't seem to have been there, because the first category of stone tools are found in abundance in all the places where you would expect these kills and the scavenging to take place. So these are the kind of stone tools that you see, and you can see these axes, what you call the hand axes, which you really use it for hack or cracking bones, they lasted for a very long time. Even when you see the next ones, which are somewhat better, even that has a very long time period, and that it's coterminous with certain other kinds of tools. This is quite an interesting one, because this is basically means that you have a plan of the tool before you start, because you sort of take off bits and pieces of the stone with a pre-imagined idea, the core that will be left, and that's what you're going to use. There is actually a nice video on a site which Bappa may remember, which we had shot at one point of time. Somebody who does this work coming and showing us how stone tools are made, and they're available. We'll circulate it at some point later. The interesting part is these stone tools are qualitatively different. And from this point onward, some of these tools seem to be something we keep with us. It's not something we throw away. So the transition is that we are getting to tools which seem to be imagined beforehand what we are going to do. They seem to be better, and they seem to be something then we keep with us, say in our pouch, in somewhere in the body, which we can then use again and again. So this change takes a very long time to emerge. Somewhere in this picture, there is a change that has taken place. And it's a change that takes place for which we still have to discuss, and we still have to come to conclusions what that change really was all about. But after this point, we seem to see a major change in the species and its interaction with others as well as with nature. So this is, I'm going to come to that change because, as you can see, this change is coterminous with certain other things. One of it is that the human species, the modern Homo sapiens, emerging as it did at a certain point of time, seemed to have spread across various continents, not here, that came much later, but across Asia and even Australia at a certain point of time. Now, that spread took place for all species, as all human species, various species have gone out and come up to this. And we're not going into details, but at some point the sea levels were lower because it was an ice age. Because of that, the land connections were easier. That's how Sri Lanka at that point of time was connected to India. So all of these during these changes, there are various human species have gone out and been populated the whole world. But the specific things that we are talking about is somewhere in this. The Homo sapiens went to Asia. They also seem to have traveled to Australia, perhaps. But that we don't seem to find in the lineage. If you take cells today and measure human genealogy, genetic study, you can check what our genes contain. We don't seem to find any remnant of that. So they did go out. We have proof they did. Okay. But we don't seem to find in the genetic lineage anything of that. That's so surprising, by the way, because we are all our genetic composition has come from what is called the original Eve and the original Adam. But the original Adam and the original Eve lived about 20,000 years between each other. Why does it happen? Because some lineages do and will disappear, and a few lineages will be, and it's a matter of chance, will remain. So that's the very nature of this, that if you trace back, that you will get an Adam and Eve who don't live at the same time, and you will also get them that they are after perhaps the first appearance of the Homo sapiens. It's not the founder population of the two are the ones who have procreated all of us, like we have in the religious texts. The Adam and Eve of religion is not what we find in biology. So our Adam and Eve lived 20,000 years apart from each other. And the point that is important is that if we look at the genetic evidence, there is no genetic shared evidence we see. And that's an interesting issue, because it means something happened which gave a huge evolutionary advantage. We wipe out all our competitors, just like the Homo sapiens variants earlier wiped out the Australopithecus, outcompeted them. In the same ecological niche, we outcompeted them very quickly because of this superior scavenging powers, shall we say. Similarly, we seem to have outcompeted all other variants, and there are variants which I'll just show you, Neanderthals being one of them. Denisovans, of course, were also there, but there are others as well. We outcompeted them very quickly. So what happens is the key issue. And here, the only major change we can find, and that's still something we are going to debate, is that we seem to have developed the ability to string words together, which means we develop the quote-unquote the language instinct, as has been defined by others. I'm not going to get into those controversies here, but we seem to have the ability now to string words together and give it meaning. B is that if we take the brain, certain changes also seem to have occurred, and that does not seem to have occurred at the time that we start the outcompeting, but it is something which seemed to have happened at a later date to the basic structure of the brain itself. And that's why I talked about the lobe, okay? That you can have structures which appear beforehand, but which evolution uses later. And one example I'll give you is that, for instance, feathers occurred in birds much before birds used them for flying. So it's not that this is unknown. There are enough examples of this, which is what Gould calls acceptations. That means when a change, an evolutionary change occurs for a particular reason, there are other things that happen which may have no beneficial or adverse impact. They're neutral. But later evolution can make use of those features for other purposes. And that's something which is there in nature. I gave you the birds and feathers, for example, which becomes very useful for flying. You can really get a effect by which you trap a large amount of air. You can rise up with the air currents and so on. So those things, that's what seemed to have happened with the brain as well, that we had features which suddenly, at one point, that evolutionary terms some small genetic change. We haven't found any major genetic change. So the argument currently is that it is not so much a genetic change, it's not the genetics itself, but in epigenetics. Now, I don't know enough about genetics, epigenetics to talk about it, but it seems to be that it's not in the DNA that you would find this change. So given this, there seems to be some small tweak that happens in which our brain is able to construct language, which can string words together and get a meaning which independently each word does not have. Now, here I would like to come to also use of sounds for communication, because this is what we are discussing. Now, the voice box of the humans are not the most advanced in the world. In fact, the birds have a much better developed sound box than we have. They in fact have two. And as you can see, bird songs are very good, very interesting. Some of the birds can imitate human beings. So it is not the construction of the sound box that's really the issue. We make sounds for communication. Animals make sounds for communication, complex sounds. And they have a vocabulary of sounds which they can communicate, any group can communicate with each other. For example, run, a black tiger or a tiger is coming from the northeast. Now they have a specific complex sound for that. So they use a number of sounds for their survival, and those sounds are known by the herd. That means it's something which is communicated, which is taught, which evolves, and is a part of what those species therefore use. But we are the only ones who seem to use language in a way which is different. Not complex sounds, but the ability to structure the sounds in a way that different meanings can be given from the same sounds. Now, I'm going to also talk about, for instance, two kinds of words that we use. I'm sorry, all this is a little technical, but I've also learned of it only a few days back, so don't worry. So there are words which are called iconic words. Iconic words are words which the sound itself communicates a meaning, and they seem to be shared across, or similarly, across different groups of human beings. For instance, we say for a dog's shouting, bhau bhau. The Europeans or the English say woof woof. Now, if you look at the structure of your mouth when saying both these sounds, they're very similar. And we can go along like this, zigzag, that the sound itself contains, in some sense, conveys the meaning. So, obviously, these are like the remnants of how we have used sounds before we developed, quote unquote, the language instinct, stringing words together. Because the current words that we use, the vocabulary which is much larger, do not correspond to iconic words. They seem to be independent of the sound effect that we create. But iconic words exist in all the languages, and they're very similar in all the languages. Other words are not. So at some point we decided that giving sound effect is not enough, that there could be other ways of communication. And one of the effect of that is that we are able to construct words, string words together. This ability to string words together, independent of the sound effect of the sounds, is really at the basis of language. And this language construction, the deep grammar of the language, if you will, which is what Chomsky says, are rules which we have evolved. Now, at one point it was thought that there is a genetic change which must be there. So there was this FOX2P gene which was said, which gives us the language instinct. But unfortunately for that theory, it fell apart because Neanderthals also have it. So it doesn't seem that why would then they get out-competed like the way they did. And this out-competition didn't happen only in Europe, where the Neanderthals were there, but other human variants which are there in Africa, many more were there, they were out-competed equally fast, and so also Denisovans in other parts of Asia, which is where they seem to have been there. Tibet, for instance, the last of the Denisovans probably were in Tibet. So all of that happens very rapidly. So something dramatic happened, and as I said, the ability is the ability to connect different things together. And here is the issue. For the first time, the human skull did not continuously expand. We didn't get a bigger brain. Neanderthals had bigger brains than us. You can see the skulls. Probably this is a slight exaggeration, but somebody was trying to make a point. But our skulls are certainly not bigger than Neanderthal skulls, a little smaller of the average. Now, this is something that did not happen earlier evolution. All earlier evolution seems to have produced a bigger brain. So the theory or the argument is, and this is Bappa's domain, that we got a connectionist brain. That means we could connect words together. And what we have in the current brain, and this again, analysis has shown this is true, that words have strong interconnections in the neural circuits of our brain. That means different word centers have very thick communication lines, as it were, between each of these groups of words. So you will quite often find that you are trying to think of somebody's name. You're not able to think of it. But you associate that person. When did you meet the person? In what context you met the person? Where does he or she live? Was it a student in your university? You start thinking of this, suddenly you remember the name. So this is the connection that you have with some area of your brain which knows this part, but this other part where the name is stored is forgotten. You're trying to remember, but this connection suddenly fires and you say, okay, that's a person. At least that's what happens to me. So I'm sure that I'm not unique. So this, and if you try to continuously think of the name, you will not remember. In fact, if you start thinking of other things connected to him or her, you'll probably remember it faster. You might remember it 5 minutes later, because the brain is still doing the algorithmic search. What is the name? So this would seem to show that structure of the brain is what changed, not the size. And therefore, it is not the size that mattered, but the fact that the interconnections gave us the possibility of then ability to string words, sounds together. Words, of course, is what we are saying, sounds together. And then the question comes, what is language? And there you enter the domain of what is called linguistics, modern linguistics. Chomsky is the founder of modern linguistics, and then talk about deep grammar and so on. Now, there are whole controversies on all of these, and the issues are not settled. If it is settled, there is something wrong with that science, because science, anything that is settled is dead. Okay? So it's all living. So the controversies are there, but it is also true that we still have to figure out what is really, quote unquote, the language instinct. And of course, these things are always divided ideologically. Some people who said, oh, this is our brains were superior, so we got all of this because you're much smarter than others. The reality is the biological evolution involved was really small. The impact was very large because language produces a huge impact. But it is not that there is a huge genetic change which led to this. So it's the point which is important for us to think about, not only for biology, for all things, that small things can have huge impact. Big things may have small impact. So that's still true for any sphere of our knowledge. And it is because what we think is small can have major impact. What we think is big may have relatively less consequences. So it's really the location of what is happening, where it is happening, that also matters. Now, this is what we have tried to see as the language development, because language for the first time makes cultural evolution possible. It's no longer biological evolution we are talking about. And this abstract sounds, meaning sounds have meaning only in the context of the language. By itself, it doesn't express anything. That's why I said the iconic words which correspond to sounds that has some relationship with the nature of the sound is not true for 99% of our vocabulary. So that is the change that has occurred, and it has also allowed us, therefore, to take, as it were, molecules and string them together as a complex compound if you are a chemistry student. Okay? So that's what language seems to have done, and therefore the variety of concepts, meanings we can produce out of a much smaller number of sounds. And that's really what the language has done for us. The interesting part is the iconic words still exist. All languages have it, and all of them are still similar. Okay? So that seems to show that there is something to this theory. Earlier we were searching for the gene, the language gene. Now we are more or less convinced that is not what happened. We have got the connectionist paradigm, as it were, of the brain, as distinct from the growth of the brain becoming more complex itself by growing, which is what we used to think earlier. Now I come to the change. This major change, language, what is its function? After all, as one of my linguistic friends, Aisha Kidwai, who's a very well-known linguistics person, she was saying, just imagine, what's the function of language if somebody starts spouting poetry in that state of competition we are in with the various other humanoids and also with other animals, because we are still at the margins. Don't forget, we're still large, basically foragers, plus those who compete with the scavengers. That's still our ecological niche. I'm not going into the savannas that we could run, we did this, we hunted, our hunting was more running down small animals and so on, which is true. But essentially all of that does not produce the dramatic change we've just talked about, because this is where we seem to separate ourselves from others. Two things that happen is, if we are able to articulate language, it means we are able to perform complex tasks as a group. So there is the increase in complexity of the group that we can handle. The second part of it is that we can plan our activities in advance. If I want to make a complex tool, okay, I know, okay, I have to do these things. If I have to do it as a group, okay, if I have to do certain things, say planning a hunt, now I have the ability to plan out the hunt because my ability to communicate more complex things have grown. So both in terms of production, which needs planning, and in terms of hunting, which also needs planning, I can plan with larger groups of people, which means the size of the group itself can expand. Now, before that, when you are essentially hunting and foraging, you had a specific area that you covered. You actually, during rains, you went somewhere. During the rainy season, you probably wanted to get into a place where you could provide some shelter for yourself. Maybe you looked at caves. We still haven't come to fire. We should come to that in a moment. But this is normally what you would do. It's not that you stayed still in one place. You covered a large area. And of course, the density of population depended on how much the large area you were covering. You could break into groups after a certain number was exceeded, and a new group would form and go off and forage in a nearby area. Now, all of this is really how you are still foraging, and you are not changing nature, but you are really foraging from nature. You are collecting from nature. So, and you did a variety of things. You hunted, you fished if you were near a river body, you saw seeds, you collected them, you stored some of it if necessary, but most of it was really getting things off from nature and moving. For different seasons, you move to different areas depending on what your needs were and what you had to protect yourself against. Of course, fire changes that. Your tools are growing, you have more weapons. At some point, you are able to tie sticks to stone tools and use them as essentially as spears. You could also use them as handheld spears. You probably used knives also in other ways. You also used smaller tools for various things. Okay? So all of these give you an edge which you didn't have earlier, but the real dominance over other species emerged not with just tools, but when you are able to control fire. Now, once you have the stone, by the way, the fire also follows, because striking flint together, you get sparks, and from that you can make fire. So it is an offshoot in some sense of the stone tools. It's not something that happens independently. Yes, you could of course have forest fire, which happens naturally, and try and keep that fire alive, but that gives you a limited control of fire. Control of fire is much more when you have the ability to strike flint together, get sparks, and able to light dry kindling or whatever it's called, and then you start the fire. Once you get control over that, it's not a big technological change, because it's the stone which gives you the sparks. But it gives you a huge edge over other species, and human beings, like now, were very destructive. So the big animals die very quickly when the Homo sapiens entered their space. Two examples, one is is Australia, where all the big animals died very quickly, and the other is Americas, when we cross over from Asia across the Bering Straits into what is now United States, that is Alaska. So when you cross over, the big animals die very rapidly. So we were very destructive of fauna. Big animals, we outcompeted them very easily. And I suspect that fire was a very big element in that. We could really use fire against them, burn them out, change their habitat, and do various things. So this change that takes place allows us to expand. It expands from, as we talked about, from Africa into Eurasian landmass. There is really no Europe, it's really Asia, Eurasia, if you will. That little bit of sticking out in the Atlantic where they talk about Europe is really because a lot of the colonial countries came from that. They wanted to make something more out of it. Otherwise, as a landmass, it's really Eurasia. And of course, Africa is joined to that, but really separated geographically. It's only Australia, which is very far away, relatively, and the Americas, which have relatively distinct flora and fauna. And before humans enter, as I said, the big animals and others have separated from Africa because of continental drift quite millions of years back. So there is not that much of commonality between the animals in the Americas and what you see in the rest of the world. The interesting part of it, some kinds of animals which we in Eurasian continent were able to tame had a big impact later. And one of them is, of course, that we had animals which could be used to drag carts, draw carts, used to shape clay vessels, of course, the wheel. But major part of it in terms of hunting is the fact, or war, particularly war, that we could use hunting chariots, but also if you have big animals which you draw carts, could also use it for construction, for trade, for other things, transporting goods. So these, not having the donkey, the horse, the buffalo, the bull, all of which can be used for these purposes, compared to that there is nothing in the Americas. And this is one significant fact which is lost sight of when people think about evolution, the Americas and Asia, Europe, particularly Europe. The second thing is when you have the people crossing over across the Bering Straits into Alaska from essentially what would be the projection of Asia, Siberia into Bering Straits. What happens is they went about, not in geological, evolutionary terms, they went not too far back. So the amount of development that they did was lagging in certain things. What? They hadn't got to iron. Okay? In evolutionary terms, 5,000 years doesn't mean anything. But cultural terms, 5,000 years, they had, the Europeans had guns, they had swords, they had iron, and the Native Americans, as we would say, the indigenous people didn't. Okay? So this difference is what is manifested, because it's interesting, civilizational terms, the complexity of those societies, their science, their mathematics was equally developed. But what they lacked was instruments of war. And that proved a 10,000 years, 5,000 years difference in evolutionary terms means nothing. Historical terms meant that they were defenseless against a European population who had gone to the Americas. The consequence we know, we'll talk of it later. But I just wanted to tell you that evolutionary terms, that this civilizational development as we are talking, the consequences of all of this are very, very significant. Now, why I showed you the earlier part is that that is still foraging. Now, before we come to what would be called settled agriculture, we'll come to that, there is a long period where we are still foraging and we are not into settled agriculture. There is a huge intermediate step, and a very interesting example is a place in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly or not. You'll have to see on Google's how it is pronounced. Now, this is a very interesting development found recently. It's not too far back, though it is known that something is there. These are monumental architecture. You would not expect that a society which had not developed settled agriculture would build this kind of monumental architecture. We have no knowledge of any settled agriculture near very large monumental architecture that was created. Recently we found that they even had a concept of a solar year. Somebody has a solar calendar marked in stone in one of the structures over there. So it took us, a lot of people didn't develop a solar calendar. They still went by this lunar calendar. Us, okay? We know about the solar calendar. We add 1 month every few years. The Hijri calendar still has lunar calendar. But they obviously knew that for certain things, they need a solar calendar. So they had a solar calendar, and it was discovered by chance when somebody pointed out, not a professional archaeologist, pointed out, hey, that's actually a solar calendar which has been marked with stone. It shows the lunar calendar, then it shows 11 days, which is extra days that have to be added to make it into, from 350 something to make it into a solar calendar. So there are people who are sophisticated enough. By the way, they used to have huge feasts. And for those who are interested, they had beer, they had bread, and they had meat. Okay? So for a lot of people, they said, oh, this is the life we want to go back to. What else do we need? But anyway, so they used to have this. But if they were not settled, what did they do? Because to create that monumental architecture, they had to live there. Groups of people would have to live there. So there are two theories, and we will not know soon what the theories which are correct and which is not, is that they would periodically come here, do this work, and go back. And that is, they took basically, they would collect food, store it in some form, or they would, the hunting that was there, that they would use that, part of the people would hunt and the other food would be stored, and then they would do the services required, or groups came periodically, some would come at some time, some would come at the other. I have no idea what is correct, because archaeologists have to settle that before I should read it. The historians and archaeologists have settled that debate before we get into it. But it is interesting because it shows the transition from really hunter-gatherers to agriculture is not as if it's a sudden event. Why is this important? This is close to what we know where settled agriculture started from. If you go to the map, I'll just go back to the earlier slide. This is Turkey. Now here is your, basically, your Mesopotamia. Here is Persia, Iran. Okay? Now this is Syria, modern. So your Tigris, Euphrates rivers are here, which is the basis of, as we know, that what emerges in this part of the world, in West Asia, and everybody accepts that's where our city-state started from. So this is very close, not too far away. And therefore, to think that the transition would take place from settled agriculture, from hunting, gathering to settled agriculture, took time is not surprising. By the way, when the Europeans went for their genocide to the Americas, there it is also what they found. There are groups of people who would be living for agriculture in a certain period and do hunting, gathering in a different period. They also found that their social structures in this switch every year changed. In one, they were more centralized, leader and so on, other more decentralized. So interestingly, when we think of society, we should not think in very rigid terms, that we have a very large variety of ways of dealing with the same problem, either social, political, or even physical. And all of those are obviously variants that can coexist till a certain group becomes strong and imposes its rules on the others, which of course is what happens later. Now, what is interesting is, obviously when you are in this foraging mode, you also understand something about seeds and what grows from seeds. You are collecting various things as you move. In the foraging, you also are able to see that if you store the seeds and you plant them or even throw them in the ground, that after some time the trees grow from there. So a foraging culture is not therefore ignorant of what is happening around it. So from this, you can see that in certain kinds of areas, you get really what would be called settler crops, where certain crops have been domesticated. Interestingly, where would you expect this to happen would be in river valleys, where the climate is not such that there are dense forests. So if you take, for instance, the Amazon, which is where here, or you take basically the river Congo and so on, dense equatorial forest. Even today, very difficult to penetrate. That's not where you would really see the agriculture to start, because clearing those forests are not possible by the tools they had at that time. Now, of course, we want to protect the Amazon from us, because we now have the tools to clear dense forests. And of course, that has very serious consequences, which are of course being discussed. So what you get is really that, say here, you get the Indus Valley civilization. This is where you get others as well, what is called West Asia or Middle East, as the Europeans will say. So these are the areas where you get the first settlements, where you start seeing agriculture, settled agriculture. What is the climate? The climate is arid, doesn't produce thick forests, so it can be cleared relatively easily. There is a certain amount of rainfall, but you need crops, it needs rain, or it needs water from the rivers. And both Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, which is really here, and you have basically West Asia over here, all of them, both of them satisfy this particular requirement. That means you have rain, but not too much. You have rivers, so therefore there is water availability, and you have therefore the possibility of settling down and having agriculture. Probably not two crops, initially one crop, and you store the seeds for year round. The seeds are of course what is your rice, wheat, millet, etc., etc. And then of course also replant a portion of it and eat of the other part. Now the interesting part of it, we have always looked upon the farmers as the main purveyors of civilization. It transpires, and this is something new genetic studies show very clearly, that I'm going to go into this. Sorry, I wanted to go over this first. I'll come back to those slides. How am I doing for time? Am I too fast? Too slow?
I mean, you can go till 7:30, 45, then we can have questions.
30 minutes, another 30 minutes. Okay, good. So this is the two things it shows. It shows you with this orange lines, which are a little faint. This is your agriculture, start of agriculture, agricultural crops. And you see they are actually in areas that is not from where this migration of the steppes population, the Indo-Aryans, Indo-Persians, the Indo-Europeans, whatever you want to call them. So this actually go over a different area, but the agrarian development takes place in different areas, takes place earlier, and then you get the steppes migration. Now, two things that I want to emphasize here, that the steppes migration takes place later. The ancient cities that emerge takes place earlier. The steppes population takes place later. And the ancient, or rather the agrarian societies that emerge in river valleys which don't have too much rainfall. That means Indo-Gangetic plains, no. Indus, yes. Gangetic plains, no. Why? Gangetic plains have much thicker forest cover. Clearing it is not easy. But therefore, West Asia, and at that time also in India, if you take Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, that those areas which are really a much larger sphere, if you will, or with West Asia, North, West Africa, Egypt, all of these areas, including Sindh, which is what we are talking about, all of those areas, Sindh and Gujarat also, all of those areas have relatively low rainfall, have rivers, and therefore the possibility of agriculture. Clearing of the forests is relatively easier and water is available. So these are the three things. If there is too much water, forest, very heavy forest, can't clear it. Even today difficult. If you have too little, then you have a problem. So those areas develop in agricultural terms, and then you have a progression, as we can see, cities and so on. But people have forgotten that actually agrarian population who are settled, they don't move. They're not really going to move from one place to another. So how do the crop, the knowledge, other things travel? And one thing we do know, that those things do travel and travel pretty quickly. So how does it happen? And the interesting part is, what is not there in our records that easily, now we are finding this, that the crops travel much faster than human genes do. That means a population which were transferring the knowledge is different from the population which is settled in agriculture. And who were they? They were really what would be called those who moved with either on horses or with their carts and so on, using other animals for taking their stuff, could be even camels, could be donkeys, whatever it is, that they were moving from village to village, if you will, carrying goods for trading purposes and also knowledge. So this record is not easy to find as the record is of settled people. Because how do you find nomadic population, their records? Okay? Now you find it in the genetic transmission that is taking place. So we find the crops have traveled much more than the signature and the genes of the people. So the people haven't traveled. They are still settled where they are, but the crops have. So some population has traveled, and we know the nomads did. So the role of nomadic population were really herder-gatherers. They travel with their animals and travel over select routes. Those are the ones, the agrarian population were scared of them because they were compact, they were mobile, and they fought probably more. They also probably traded and looted. Human beings are not nice, you know that, right? So there's always been this sphere of the people like this, but also necessary for trade. So both things, if you see the literature, both these things are there. But the interesting thing that we have discovered, that not so much human genetic exchange, but the crops travel faster than the human beings did. By the way, women travel much more than men. Can you tell me why? Tell me, somebody. If you take genetic distance between mother and daughter worldwide, any community, you will find the women have traveled more. From the mother to daughter, the distance is larger than amongst father to son. That's an easy answer.
To save children.
Why would the men kill the children? Because women marry outside their family. The men don't. The men stay put. The women are the one who travel and carry also cultural knowledge, other things along with them. So interesting that we don't think of it like that, right? We always think men are the travelers. No, that's one Ibn Battuta, one Marco Polo here and there. But otherwise, women always have traveled because groups have to meet. Earlier, what we saw groups, they actually used to meet on specific occasions. Why do you think they met? Because the numbers are small. There are not enough marriageable age children independently. The small groups for surviving as foraging population. And they met in order to have enough marriageable children on both sides. Enough boys and girls. Just widen the pool. So they used to meet 5, 6 ancestral groups would meet together. Then they would have a feast, okay? That's how holidays come about. That these are basically connected to something in nature, but also for the fact that you needed a gene pool which was larger than what each group could provide, okay? So the role of this nomadic bee population has been underestimated, and as we develop more and more, the fear of the nomadic population, so you see walled cities and so on. Interestingly, all the areas of the world don't go through that cycle. I'll come to that. Let me go back to my slides. Yeah, this is where we were. So this is all Purvasha's fault because she sent me the topic by email only today. So I didn't know where I had to end my first lecture. And she denied it also on top of it. She said, I've sent it to you. I said, yes, you have, but on Signal. That disappeared. I was making my slides, final slides today. I have to blame somebody. So, anyway, the Fertile Crescent is more studied for two reasons. One, the Europeans were interested in it. It was near to where they were. B is that the fact is also the climate. It preserves a lot much more easily. So it's been much more well studied. Now, you would find there it's very interesting. If you really look at it, there is a Tigris Euphrates over here. This is what is called the Levant. There you also get rainfall because you've got the equivalent to the monsoons there. So you get some rainfall and there is precipitation here. And then you have across this is Egypt. And Egypt means a Nile. So you have very regular water supply, Nile inundation, which is very regular again. So you have this whole area. It's not independent. It's adjoining Persia, where also you have development of agriculture, very similar. Then you have India, where also essentially the Indus Valley, where also you have development of agriculture. But genetically, we can now see the Indus Valley people were different. So the agricultural knowledge traveled, but the people really were not the same. So this also happens in other places we can see, but there is a large area where knowledge as well as development of crops are taking place. So again, one would assume there is a flow of knowledge at least amongst people, and that also meant the species, the animals, all of that are also then spreading across this belt. So this is a repetition of the same. So when I was looking at all this, I used to think all pots must be called pottery. Okay? Apparently, when it comes to historians and archaeologists, they think potteries are only when you bake it to a certain temperature. If you make a pot, keep it in the sun and use it, no, it's not a pottery. Okay? So this is what I discovered. So pottery is very important. If you want to make pots which will be hard enough, durable enough, you need to bake them to a certain temperature, which means an open fire will not get you that. It will get you a pot in my sense of the term, but it won't get in the archaeologist sense of the term. Okay? So then you need to bake it, means you need a kiln. Now the interesting part of the kiln, I'll come to the potter's wheel a little later. Kiln is that when you are firing this kiln, that you need an updraft for higher temperature and more even temperature. So here is what this does. There is a gap here. So the basically hot air goes, as you know, it rises. That much of physics you would have learned in school, right? Hot air rises. And then you get this part of it, which is very hot, but it's evenly heated. See, if you're very close to the fire, you will get uneven heating. So you put it over here, okay? And these are really concentric gaps like that. And then you have this flue, like used to be chimney once upon a time. And then you have the flow of air, hot air going up. And you can keep these things on the top and the heat much more evenly. So this is an engineering construction that has to be made. And this is, in that sense, technology is developing to be able to do all of these things. Okay? That essentially you now have people who also look at not only what things they have to do with agriculture, but there are people who are developing who know how to do these things. Okay? So in some sense, differentiation in terms of occupation is taking place. Now, the potter's wheel is very important because it also brings us the concept of a wheel. Now, did the wheel develop first or the potter's wheel develop? Probably the wheel developed first because it was used for carrying goods. Okay? Where did it develop? Again, debates. Some say it was either in Mesopotamia, West Asia, or some parts of it independently could have been discovered in other parts of the world. They said Eastern Europe also, there are examples of wheels and carts and so on. Again, what we know is that this developed essentially much more in West Asia first, and of course spread to others. And the potter's wheel, which is very important, develops when you can make pots much more quickly and much better because it's productivity increase that takes place. Once you've got the furnaces, then you essentially that's why I showed you the furnace where pots are being baked. The development of the furnaces means the possibility of metallurgy. Open fire does not get you the metals that we are looking for. Maybe lead, yes. Certain things, zinc and lead, low temperatures will melt. But when you're talking of iron and steel, those kind of things, particularly iron, even bronze, the temperatures required become higher. And therefore, you need to have people who can create and maintain these furnaces. Some specialization, obviously, but this is what gives rise to what would be called the metal age. But the interesting part of it is metal. When it comes to bronze and copper, yes, you can make metals out of, you can make weapons out of them. They were made weapons out of. But the amount of copper, etc. you get in nature is not very large, unlike iron, which is available much more widely. So the Bronze Age, in fact, a lot of places you don't see weapons being important. And I'll come to which one that we know of very well. But in certain places, it was used extensively for war. Maybe they had more access to copper deposits, or they wanted to use it for war for specific benefit they thought they would get. So you start seeing bronze, rise of metals, the Bronze Age, but really the role of metals in war is much more when you come to iron. The reason I'm saying this, because our history has been deeply tainted by the fact, let me skip this, deeply tainted by the fact that we think that whatever Europeans have said about history must be right. So they have talked about weapons, bronze and age. They have focused really on West Asia and on Greeks and Romans. And I'll come to Greeks, Romans, and West Asia in a few minutes. I promise you I won't take too much time. Okay. So this is where you start seeing that towns are separating themselves from the nearby areas by becoming fortified towns. Mesopotamia, this is the first fortified town, Sumerian city of Ur, 3800 BC. This is not a picture taken at that time. This is somebody has drawn this. Okay. So this is what they have done with excavations, that they have constructed what they thought is a town based on the excavations. But you start seeing walled cities emerge in West Asia. And soon, how did the cities emerge where they really centralized monarchies, kingdoms, what was the structure? All still open for discussion. Yes, there are cities which were ruled by few people, hereditary. Laws were there. Hammurabi's laws are known. But it is also true there are possibilities that there are also citizens groups which control the state. That yes, therefore, for instance, what you see in Rome later, that you have the rich had their assemblies and the Senate decided who would be the leader during war. And you could have even elections, but again, only those who are elite could vote. So it is not democratic the way we see it. But nevertheless, there is also the proposition that all civilization did not pass through essentially walled cities and warriors controlling the cities. That this was in some, not all. And the most important example for us is Harappa, Mohenjo-daro Harappa. Harappan civilization is strange. We don't find city walls. We don't find castles like the medieval castles. We don't really find that kind of structure. Yes, there is social stratification in the settlement that you see, but you seem to see doesn't seem to be standing armies of the kind that you think about when you talk about Mesopotamia or you talk about the Greeks and the Romans later. So it does seem there is possibilities of cities, and this also has been argued about Mesopotamia as well, that possibility that this kind of picture of warriors controlling the state and the state being much more, in that sense, under the, shall we say, the rule of the sword is not universal. And Mohenjo-daro Harappa is a place where we have the same weights and measures, the same seals, roughly, which cover a very large distance. So therefore, the argument that it is possible to have a less aggressive structure, which primarily depended on stage, at least till the Bronze Age. Why the Bronze Age? Because bronze weapons were not large in number. And if you are equipped with stone tools and other stuff, well, you could equalize between few warriors and yourselves. So a narrow stratum of militarized elite could not control these kingdoms for too long. And therefore, the possibility of a Harappan kind of control over a large area. So maybe they are independent towns, they are independent cities. Maybe they are based on trade. They trade with each other. Therefore, you have a common set of symbols, which you see in the seals. Somebody has done research claiming the seals were really trade, basically saying what is the goods and what is the something or the other. So there is really available for the purpose of the seals were really trade, identifying who was the producer, who was the buyer, something like that. What is the class of goods? Maybe. Difficult to say because we have not deciphered the Mohenjo-daro Harappa seals. And since we have not, we don't know what they really mean. That history is not known to us. But it is interesting that the same weights and measures are available, the same symbols are available over a very large area. And that would seem to indicate there is a unification of certain kind which existed either religious or trade-wise, which meant people communicated with each other, but it was not an empire in the sense of the term that we use it. Is there another example like this which you know about, and we know about much more than this? Yes, the Phoenicians, who actually traded across the whole Mediterranean, they used alphabets, they seemed to use a common language. They probably were not from one particular area because they traded across a very large area. So the possibility it was a trading language. The Phoenician alphabet, which is 22 characters, is the base of almost all current alphabets, including the Romans, including Indian alphabets. This is the 22 characters, except the Chinese. They have, as you know, a different script. Almost everywhere else, it is the what is called the Roman new alphabets. But as you know, we have the same base, but a different name for it. All of this actually came from essentially the Phoenician alphabet. In fact, the Europeans also acknowledge that the Greeks got their alphabet from Phoenicians. They added the vowels. Of course, they take credit. We are the only ones who added the vowels. Arabic does not use vowels, for example, but it uses the 22 Phoenician alphabet, as did also the Jews. Originally, all of them use the same alphabet from which all of this evolves. So the question here is that all societies passing through this class dominance of a few warriors, as the conventional mental picture we have, is not true. And it is, as I said, this is something which was found in Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, which has been a question mark. But if you look at Mesoamerica, where also you have a history of civilizations before the Europeans came in, you find that they seem to have had both structures, class structures, hereditary aristocracy, but also large areas which seem to have had communitarian assembly form of society. So, argument here is, before you get iron weapons and later on the guns, it was possible to think of multiple ways of society being structured. After that, of course, you get the European era by which they control the seas and the land later. And now, after that, you get the Americans who say they control everything in the world because they're the bestest in the worldist. If you leave all of that out, the whole idea that there was a homogeneous base to human civilization as we know it today seems to be wrong. There are multiple ways of which societies developed. At some point, due to military dominance, they become more homogeneous, and that's what we see also today. So I'm going to leave you with questions, because if you think history has answered all the questions, or there's some wise man sitting somewhere who knows all the answers, that's not what has happened. Even the language issue that we now I talked about is something which is developed in the last 5 to 10 years. This knowledge is continuously, in that sense, developing new things we are finding out. What we know for today will maybe change tomorrow. So knowledge has a way of growing, but the important part of it is that when you look at history today, what you have learned in school is changing continuously. And some of the things that we are learning today is that we need to relook at various aspects of history and see which needs to change, which does not. The only thing we can say is that those views which seem to project superiority of a certain groups, certain either social groups or what would be called racial groups, that they are entirely wrong. We know enough about our genetic makeup to say that between different groups, either in a place or geographically disparate places, the differences in humanity is very little. As I said, one troop of chimpanzees have more variety than what we have in the entire 7 billion human population, and that would seem to indicate no group. Yes, within a group somebody may be faster, may be able to beat up others better, may be able to argue with others better. Those differences exist, but there is no genetic basis to those differences in any sense. So this is where we are, and what is true biologically is also true culturally, that no culture is superior to another culture per se. It is the historical difference that we have to look at, the development we have to look at, and therefore a much more open outlook towards looking at history and looking at civilization itself, and of course what do we call civilization. Open questions, I'm not giving you answers. Questions of therefore what is civilization is still something we have to evolve, because earlier civilization was really determined by who had the gun. Okay? Even now, who has the atom bomb? Now we have reached a stage, there are about X number of countries who have the bomb. If a few bombs explode, civilization as we know it will not. So therefore we have reached the stage where either we behave as civilized people or evolution will stop because we won't be there. Okay. So that's where we are at, and therefore also to look at this not from the point of view is why A is better than B, but what has really happened in history, and therefore to look at how should we look at history. The whole lecture I'm giving you is how should we look at history, not what is my view and you should accept whatever I'm saying, but how should we look at history itself. To accept change is something which will continuously take place, and the fact that our history is showing that humanity is equality within humanity is far more than we think. And the reason we think we do not think like that is because of the kind of class society that we live in, or differences in terms of those who colonized us and made up their own history. And that is a subsequent lecture, if you still come to my next lecture, which is the development of what we would call the West. How did West take over the world and what led to it? And before that, what was Europe? And I'm just giving you a hint that Europe was actually thought to be the place where barbarians lived. Okay? That this is not something which people thought was particularly interesting for anybody else. In fact, the whole question of the Roman conquest of Britain was, why are we going and taking over that place? It's so backward. Okay? So from that to where we are today is a huge change. And that shift I would like you to think about when you look at history, whether you come to my next lecture or not. And also look at the globe, not from the point of view of the map that you see on your textbook, but take a globe and look at it. And also think about what is West, what is East, what is the size of Europe, what is the size of the rest of the world. Why does Americas and Canada look so big? Okay. Why does Europe look bigger than what it actually is on the globe? These are questions I leave for you. Okay. I think I've done my job.